Yeah, it's recorded. Take it away.
Okay, let me share the screen.
Yeah.
So once again, thanks for coming. I mean, for inviting me. I think this has been a great pleasure. I mean, to hear that you wanted to sort of hear from me about Stoicism. I mean, I thought about what to do today, and you know, let me see if you can see this, can't you?
We can see it, but I think you can still, if you press, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I think I thought about what to do today, and I thought one idea was to present one important theme from Stoic ethics with a slightly more critical, in some sense, attitude than perhaps some of you might be used to, namely not from within Stoicism, but in very general terms. Not because I want to endorse all this criticism, but because I think sometimes even people like us who are, you know, big fans of Stoicism, we take some ideas for granted, or we are so, in some sense, we're so in love with the general, you know, thrust of Stoicism that some ideas that are particularly controversial do not get sufficient scrutiny. So I thought I could give you some sort of provocative, mainly to provoke discussion, okay, topic about the doctrine of the indifference, okay, which is obviously crucial to the Stoics ethics, and is something that is particularly controversial because it is in some sense extreme, okay. So what I want to do today basically is to present in the first part of this very short, I promise, presentation, some ideas about from ancient Greece and ancient philosophy in areas surrounding the doctrine of the indifference, okay, namely alternatives to the doctrine of the indifference that in some sense address the same issue as the doctrine of the indifference wants to address. And in the second part, I want to present the Stoic view and sort of yes, point you to some difficulties that I see. You may or may not agree with me with the Stoic notion of indifference. But let me start with a very, very simple consideration, namely that in Greek mentality, I'm not talking about philosophy necessarily here, I'm talking about what was the current idea among Greek intellectuals, aristocrats, people who had an interest in words like wisdom, okay, or Sophia, or whatever. There is a very general idea that is somehow completely uncontroversial, and that is an alternative, you think about it, to the Stoic notion of the indifference. This is the idea of moderation, and in particular, the two twin ideas of moderation and the avoidance of excess. These ideas are part and parcel of the ancient Greeks' mentality, right from the very beginning of Greek society as we know it. For instance, there is this interesting and famous testimony from the 2nd century BC geography writer Pausanias, okay, a contemporary, by the way, of Marcus Aurelius. He lived under Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. In his geography book, I mean, Description of Greece, Pausanias write the following interesting sentence. In the fourth temple at Delphi are written maxims useful for the life of man, inscribed by those whom the Greeks say were sages. These sages then came to Delphi and dedicated to Apollo the celebrated maxims. Know thyself, and nothing in excess. So two recommendations, okay, two general ideas here. Know thyself and nothing in excess, that somehow go together. One implication of the notion of moderation is that the external goods, okay, the things that you know, are external to ourselves, both to our body and to our mind, namely wealth, for instance, power, good looks, reputation, friends, and so on and so forth, but also the goods of the body, health, physical strength, do make a contribution to our happiness and well-being if taken with moderation. Okay, so the central idea here is that these things are not per se negative components in our life. They are not negative elements in our life, but they need to be taken with moderation. Another implication is that they are not the main component of our well-being and happiness, because in the two maxims that are just quoted from Pausanias, from the Pausanias chapter, there is an emphasis on the Socratic, later Socratic and Stoic, know thyself. Okay, this is the intrinsic, we might say, aspect of happiness. Happiness is mainly about knowing yourself. Okay, then there is the sort of extrinsic aspect, we might say, the way we relate to things that are not our true self, like perhaps our body and the external goods. And there we need to apply moderation. But the emphasis remains on the intrinsic aspect of happiness. If you compare, for instance, a very famous maxim from the 6th, 5th century BC philosopher Heraclitus, who was dear to the Stoics for many reasons, including his theory of cosmic fire, okay, and other things, and the importance that he attributes to the logos. Heraclitus says, I searched for myself, okay, where the self here is the logos, the rationality that Heraclitus believes is common to everybody, to actually, in some sense, to the universe as a whole. And so it's not surprising that the Stoics then found in Heraclitus a source of inspiration. But I want to insist here that there are two components here to happiness, not on an equal footing, obviously. The intrinsic component, know thyself, the Socratic component, and then some sort of extrinsic component, that is some sort of some sort of use of the external things and bodily goods with moderation. If used with moderation, they are not bad. Okay. Now, this idea is widespread in ancient philosophy. You can find it in Plato, for instance. You find it even in Epicurus. One of my students last year wrote an MA dissertation on the notion of excess in Epicurus, showing that Epicurus was as much hostile to the notion of excesses as much as Aristotle or the Stoics. So this idea that, you know, there is an intrinsic aspect to happiness, the knowledge of yourself, the development of flourishing as a rational being, and an external component is absolutely common in Greek philosophy. But I would say that this notion finds its more rigorous formulation in Aristotle. Aristotle is, the person who gives philosophical content to this general intuition that the Greeks seem to have had about moderation and rationality. For Aristotle, external goods and goods of the body, okay, are necessary for happiness. I want to read very quickly this very famous passage from the end of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, okay, where Aristotle makes this particularly clear. He says, it seems clear that happiness needs the addition of external goods, as we have said. For it is difficult, if not impossible, to do fine deeds without any resources. Many can be done, as it were, by instruments, by the help of friends, or wealth, or political influence. Okay, so Aristotle here is stating clearly as possible that we do need, okay, external goods and goods of the body, but my emphasis will be in particular on external goods to be happy, because it's mentioning fine deeds which stem from a virtuous character, and the activity of a virtuous character is a happy activity, a felicitous activity. And so these activities cannot be done without any resources. Some resources are okay. Obviously, external goods and goods of the body remain a secondary component of happiness for Aristotle, as the virtues, both the ethical virtues, the virtues of character, and the intellectual virtues remain the main component. So Aristotle gives voice and gives a sort of philosophical form to a notion that is common in Greek thought, okay, at all levels, Greek mentality and Greek philosophy. The idea, just to state it again, is that there is an intrinsic component to happiness, okay, which is the development of the virtues, and most of all, the exercise of the virtues. And then there is a sort of external component that is the external goods, okay, that are necessary for Aristotle, quite literally necessary for happiness. Okay, I think it's important before we move to Stoicism not to misunderstand Aristotle's view, okay, because sometimes, especially from the Stoic point of view is certainly more radical. These views get slightly misrepresented as the view, in a way, that as the view that external things make us happy, okay, to some extent. But I would argue that this is not Aristotle's idea. For Aristotle, power, reputation, good looks, etc., all the external goods, do not, strictly speaking, make us happy, because only virtue does. It's true for Aristotle as well that virtue remains what generates, causes, brings about whatever our happiness. External goods for Aristotle are simply necessary external conditions of happiness. What do I mean by necessary external conditions of happiness? That without these things, you couldn't be happy. But it's not that the presence of these things makes you happy. In particular, this is a point that I think is important, and if some of you were at one of the Stoic events, perhaps the one at Birkbeck a few years ago, or perhaps the one that we attended all together, a point that was emphasized by one of the invited speakers. I mean, the possession, in particular for Aristotle, the possession of external and bodily goods, sorry, there is a typo there, removes obstacle to our full development of as human beings. Okay, this notion of obstacles is crucial, I think. Namely, Aristotle believes that for human beings to fully function, namely to be fully rational, they must operate in a context that is conducive to their, development. So, for instance, poverty is something that must be removed to allow people to focus on the important things and to develop themselves as human beings. One of the speakers at the Stoic event emphasized the potentially reform-oriented, aspect of this idea. I mean, for Aristotle, it's important that socio-economical conditions, in a way, be appropriate for the development of human beings. But, and that's another point that I want to emphasize, is that excesses in external goods are for Aristotle vicious, not just unacceptable, they are vicious and provide even more obstacles to happiness than the absence of external goods. If we are greedy, if we want money, if we want power per se, not as an instrument, but per se, this is vicious character. And so there is a fine line, there's a thin line between being virtuous and so using the external goods appropriately as instruments, and becoming vicious in a way by running into some sort of race for the external goods. Okay, so this is Aristotle's position from which I wanted to start, because I think it's particularly representative of the Greeks' attitude towards material things, external goods, and their recommendation that we take them with moderation, okay, and focus instead on what makes us really happy, namely the development of our character. Okay, so the question is, do we need more than Aristotle? Okay, namely, do we need more than that? Do we need more than developing a character that is balanced in this particular way, that is self-controlled and moderate with respect to external goods, okay, and bodily goods? The Stoics, as you know perfectly well, think that we do need more than Aristotle. For the Stoics, bodily goods, as much as their opposites, okay, external and bodily evils, are indifferent. What we call, obviously, external and bodily goods are indifferent. Only virtue is good, only vice is bad, and all other things are indifferent. Okay, so as is absolutely, that's pretty known, but just to summarize a little bit their idea and to distinguish it from Aristotle's idea, virtue for the Stoics is the only component of happiness and is therefore not only necessary for happiness, that's obvious for Aristotle as well, it's absolutely necessary to be virtuous to be happy, but also sufficient for happiness. If you have the virtues, you don't need anything else, okay? We are, all of us, who have read some Stoicism and practice sometimes some Stoicism and read in particular, texts that are, the sort of the handbooks of Stoic philosophy, we are all familiar with the distinction between preferred and dispreferred indifference that the Stoics defend. Okay. In other words, sometimes people say natural and unnatural indifference. Okay, because as a matter of fact, preferred indifference are those that are in accordance with nature, we might say. Dispreferred ones are those that are in contrast with nature. So the Stoics claim that being unqualifiedly good, preferred indifference do have value for us. Normally, they have value for us, and so we tend to select them, other things being equal, so to speak. By contrast, without being unqualifiedly bad, this preferred indifference have this value for us. And so we tend to deselect them, okay, not to select them, other things being equal. But so that's common knowledge. But I want to remind ourselves that the introduction of this distinction by Zeno was not uncontroversial. There is a vein of radicalism in Stoicism. Okay, for instance, Aristotle, one of Zeno's contemporaries, was strongly opposed to the distinction and argued that indifferents are just indifferent. They can't be split into preferred and dispreferred. They are just irrelevant. Okay, a slightly cynic influence on Stoicism. But also some of the Roman Stoics, for instance, our beloved Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations. If we read the Meditations, I'm sure that Marcus was in agreement with the doctrine of this preferred and preferred indifference, but it doesn't make much of them. I can't remember many chapters in the Meditations in which he talks about the importance, for instance, of selecting preferred indifference because they are in accordance with reason or with nature, the way, for instance, Cicero says at some point On Duties. I can't remember, I'm sure there are some allusions, but it's not one of the central claims in Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius seems to operate with a broad distinction between virtue on the one hand and all other things on the other, okay, without making any further internal distinction. Okay, So there is a vein of radicalism in Stoics. Okay. The question, and this is, in a sense, the final part of my topic, but perhaps for some of you, the potentially the more interesting, do we need something as rigorous as that? We need to say that external goods and bodily goods are indifferent. Okay. In other words, how can we justify the doctrine of the indifference from a Stoic point of view, obviously? Well, I mean, I thought about this a little bit from a philosophical perspective, but also from the perspective of the ancient material, and came up with three arguments, okay, from Stoic sources. I'm sure there might be others, and I would be very happy if you could, in the question time, you know, suggest other reasons that I haven't seen or that I haven't thought about. Namely, three reasons that we could use to claim that we do need the doctrine of the indifferent. One reason is the up to us, not up to us distinction. Okay. The second idea is the idea of rationality. And the third, and perhaps most famous criterion, is the use-misuse idea. So let's see this very quickly, okay, in some sense, and see if they work. And I'll tell you what I think, but obviously it will be important for our discussion to see also what other people think. It's here that I want to present. I'm going to present a slightly more critical sort of point of view, but you know, that doesn't mean that I'm going to endorse all this criticism, okay, necessarily, but they are possibilities. So the first idea is what I call Epictetus move, okay, because the up to us, not up to us idea, I would say, is certainly implicit in early Stoicism. I mean, I don't want to claim that it wasn't there in Chrysippus or Zeno, but it's not expressed in as strongly as it is expressed in Epictetus. Epictetus is the person who somehow thinks that one of the crucial aspects of Stoicism is the distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. I mean, in the very first few lines of the handbook, he says that's a passage that everybody knows, but just to remind ourselves, some things are up to us, while others are not to us. Up to us are conception, choice, desire, aversion, and in a word, everything that is our own doing. Not up to us are our own body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, everything that is not our own doing. Okay. Obviously, the main point here is that Epictetus believes that the way we react to things, okay, is completely up to us. So things might happen. Some we can influence, but most of them happen, you know, outside our control. But certainly, what's within our control is the way we react to things, the way we think about them, the choices that we make in relation to things, the things that we desire, the things that we want to avoid. Okay, the selection that we make of our responses. But you may notice that the things that are not up to us are what the Stoics call indifferents: body, property, reputation, office. Okay. So one could say, perhaps the indifferents are indifferent because they are not up to us, while virtue, according to the Stoics, is entirely up to us. I mean, it's it's our choice in a way if we want to be virtuous. If it's our choice if we progress towards virtue. But you know, think about it. Isn't this strategy a little bit defensive? Namely, since some things are outside our control, we say that they are indifferent. They don't matter. That they don't make any contribution to happiness. It doesn't seem that this move of identifying indifference with the things that are not up to us really works. It's the because, as I say here, that seems to be wrong. I mean, suppose that there is something that is absolutely essential to our happiness. But this something is completely not up to us. I mean, it's completely the result of chance. This might happen. For instance, Epicurus thinks that nature is not our friend. Nature is neutral. Nature is what it is, and we need to make the most of it. There might be many things in nature that are absolutely essential to our happiness, but still, are outside our control. That's how things are. So to say that something is indifferent because it's outside our control seems to me to be non-convincing. Okay, that's not, seems to be the acceptance, in a sense, of a situation, the situation in which we live, in which things are partly outside our control, rather than a positive suggestion. Okay, so these are my thoughts about Epictetus' move. The second idea, rationality, that's common in Stoic sources as well. Namely, this is related vaguely to the Stoic idea of oikeiosis, okay, the idea that we develop naturally as rational beings. And so we develop naturally as beings interested in virtue, okay. And so they say virtue is the only good because it's the only thing that preserves us as rational beings. Okay. While the indifferents do not, or at least may not, preserve us as rational beings. If you think about it, I mean, what they want to say is very easy, on the face of it, not completely unreasonable. They say, okay, the external goods might keep us alive, might make our life conditions better, but they don't preserve us in our true nature, namely as rational beings. Only something that is inside us, okay, that is the full expression of our rationality, preserves and promotes us as rational beings, okay. But one could say, okay, fair enough. I think point here, because it's true that in some sense, these other things, the external goods, help us to live, but perhaps don't affect us immediately as rational beings. Because also animals, for instance, I need food or shelter or comfort to some extent. But one could say, why shouldn't external goods promote our rationality, let's say, indirectly, as Aristotle says? For instance, by making it sure that we operate as rational beings in the best possible conditions. Namely, we can grant the Stoics that, for instance, some financial security doesn't, concern my rationality as such. But why shouldn't I claim that this makes me more rational in the sense that it helps me to find contextual conditions I might operate better. Now, the Stoics certainly do not deny at all, actually they claim, that rational beings make rational use of external goods. Okay, that's part of the idea behind the preferred indifference notion. Okay, namely, it's part of our nature, of our capacity to right external goods, and we do what we can with them. Okay, but they insist that this idea that rational beings certainly make rational use of external goods is not equivalent. They are a determining factor in preserving our rationality. Namely, they think that a human being, even in extreme conditions, in extreme poverty, for instance, can still fully open. Aristotle would disagree, would say that there are conditions that are so difficult externally that even your rationality is impeded or hampered. Okay. And so this idea of rationality as well is questionable, even though as I said, the Stoics, external goods don't make a direct contribution to our rationality. They might make an indirect one. Okay, final point. This is the perhaps the most well-known argument for the view that external goods are indifferent. And this one as well is with ideas in Greek culture. Namely, the idea, for instance, that what is good is beneficial. Okay, that's an idea that many ancient philosophers, I'm thinking of Plato, for instance, and others, what good must be beneficial. Okay. They say, the Stoics say, only what can never be misused can be unqualifiedly good. Okay, so they propose to restrict the notion of good that in ordinary life we apply to so many things. They suggest to restrict this notion to what can never be misused. Okay, so even preferred indifference, they argue, can in principle be misused. And this preferred indifference can be used well. Okay. Before I sort of make, a point about this argument, which is absolutely central to Stoicism, I want just to clarify one thing about this use of the meaning of the term use. Okay, I mean, obviously we do translate from these texts and from Greek and Latin texts, and that's a literal translation, use. I mean, indifference can be misused. But I think what the Stoics mean, that makes their idea both more convincing and more radical in a way. They take this notion of use very broadly. Just to give you an example. Suppose that, let's take the example of health. Okay, suppose that I'm taking some pills to keep me alive. Okay, they work very well. And I keep, taking them, and there is nothing wrong with me. But then at some point I come to know that the production of these fundamental medicines is based on exploitation, for instance, of children, or medicines are being produced on some other fishy grounds. Okay, then this is what they mean when they say health can be misused, because then I face the moral dilemma whether to take the pills or to abstain. And perhaps they would argue. I mean, this example was suggested to me by Julianus, but it's very much in line with Stoic thought. I mean, they would say, I mean, if you take the pills, you are misusing your health. Namely, you are using your health in a way that is not compatible with a virtuous card, because you have information now about the provenance of these pills, and so you should abstain. Okay, so when I say use, I think this notion shouldn't be taken too strictly, okay, as we, in the sense in which we use instruments or tools. Okay, finally, I want to raise a potential objection to this argument as well. As I say here, I'm not entirely sure about this argument either. Why should the intrinsic value of a thing, for instance, depend on how I use it or can use it? Okay, suppose either a certain thing, an external good, promotes my well-being or it doesn't. Why should the way I use it be relevant to whether or not it is good? For instance, if we agree with Aristotle that certain socio-economical conditions are important for people to flourish individually and collectively, the fact that there are people who misuse, okay, wealth or or any other external goods or power should be completely irrelevant. I mean, it's just that there are bad people around, people who haven't understood, I mean, the value of things. But why should I say that since there are people who misuse this, these external goods have no unqualified goodness? Okay, that's something that I fail to see to some extent. So basically, just to sum up, I mean, what I've tried to do is to show two things. One is that for the Greeks, there is a natural alternative, less radical alternative to the doctrine of the indifference. This is the idea that virtue is the main component of happiness, and the external goods need to be used with moderation. The Stoics do advance reasons to go beyond, okay, this traditional idea. And some of these reasons are, all of them actually are very interesting. But what I try to say is that they are not completely unquestionable, okay? But obviously, I'm mostly interested in knowing what you think. What do you think? So thank you so much. I hope, Carmelo, I kept it short enough and not too long.
Yeah, no, very much so. You're great timing. You did say 30 minutes, isn't it? So just over 30 minutes.
Okay, good, good.
So I'm just wondering how, let me see if I can see everyone. Yeah, I think I can see everyone on the one page. So I guess if anyone wants to ask a question, if you can just raise your hand and then you can unmute yourself. Fadi, yeah, go ahead. Fadi and then Terry.
Regarding the last bit about unqualified good, I wonder if he meant the good as the action, or using the action of use or misuse is what's termed as good, because items in themselves have no good or bad in them. I mean, the goodness is in the action, not in the thing. So I wonder if he meant, because you're saying it didn't make sense to you, and I think it wouldn't otherwise.
I mean, I think the Stoics do conceive. I mean, when they talk about these things like good and bad, you're right. Obviously, they want to talk about good and bad actions mainly, but they do offer lists of traditional items, that people consider good and bad. Okay, like the ones that I mentioned, and they say these ones are not good or bad unqualifiedly. Okay, so they seem to be happy at least to accept, for the sake of argument, that some things are, considered by common people to be good, like, for instance, wealth or reputation, and they say they're not good. I mean, they do have some value for us, but they are happy to talk about things that are good or bad as well, just not action, at least for the sake of argument. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we got Terry.
Yes, I was thinking in deciding between Aristotle and the Stoics, it's interesting to pick extreme examples. It just happened that I've been reading Edith Eger's book about her experience during the Holocaust and her sister.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the two girls were in extremis essentially for about a year. But they kept each other alive, so that when there's an opportunity to escape by oneself, they don't take that opportunity, and then they take risks to, find carrots and things like that, even at considerable risk themselves, to keep the other one alive. And another intriguing thing actually is about the book is that the kind of motto that they have at the beginning is not actually Epictetus, but it's something very similar about the importance of the internal life as opposed to what's happening to them. And And thinking about that is one of the things that she attributes to actually surviving, you know, the 12 months of difficult to imagine difficulties, actually. So, so that seemed to me to support a Stoic view that even in these circumstances, there is still, you know, the opportunity for extremely limited opportunity, but very important opportunity for virtue, I guess, and for flourishing in an extremely narrow sense.
Yes, I think it's a very, I mean, it's a, thank you. I mean, it's a very interesting idea. I mean, I think Aristotle, I mean, that there might be people, okay, there might be people who are good enough or strong enough to sort of survive in those circumstances, and that they might use, they might find even in those conditions some sort of a way into the real self, so to speak. Okay, that I think might not mean that you know, in general, this is what I mean. In general, an Aristotelian would say, in general, we do need better conditions, even for the discovery of our real self. But then, obviously, you could say, Terry, that what the two girls did is all to everybody. It's just a matter of reflection, self-analysis, self-awareness, self-understanding. And that's exactly the Stoic point, okay? That it is in principle open to everybody, because the Stoics obviously, on the one hand, they say virtue is possible, and on the other hand, they say, I mean, there aren't basically virtuous people around, perfectly virtuous people around. So it's a way of living, it's an ideal, so to speak. But certainly the example, I agree, could be used to give strength to the Stoic idea. And because the Stoics as well would certainly in general think that the obstacles that Aristotle talks about should be removed. I mean, they have nothing against that. They are not indifferent to, in that sense, to what's happening in the world. They're just saying, even if, okay, even if your expectations are not met, even if you should live in the worst possible situation, you can still be happy. Okay. So yes, I think it's a good point, perhaps in favor of the Stoics.
I think it's very interesting what you just said, Gabriele, because you tend to think of Stoicism like a very democratic, you know, philosophy in principle, isn't it? So virtue is accessible to everyone, regardless of your external circumstances. But you, if I'm correct, interpreting what you said it's perhaps it's special people who can thrive in extremely difficult circumstances. It's not just, you know, your ordinary man or woman who can do that. So that's quite interesting.
I think, you know, you're right. I mean, the Aristotelian position historically, I mean, Aristotle, when he was writing, was thinking of happiness as exclusive in some sense, you know, as something that belongs only to a certain class of people. Okay, people who have received the right education, that live in the right conditions, for whom, let's say, there are no obstacles, socioeconomical obstacles. But it must be said that on the basis of other things that Aristotle says, for instance, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics, some people today turn things a little bit the other way around. They say Aristotle's ideas can be read as an invitation to make the conditions, okay, the conditions in which we live, the best possible conditions for everybody. Namely, we have a responsibility to make society as good as possible, to allow people to flourish and to find their happiness. Okay, so it's a sort of progressive, slightly progressive interpretation of Aristotle, but that is in conflict, obviously, with some things he says in the Ethics, but not with some thoughts that he seems to have about the perfect society. Okay, a perfect society is a society in which people live well because they don't have to. I think obviously Aristotle, they had slaves, but that's a, I mean, I think some of the things that he says could be adapted to partly slave-free society like ours. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just thinking about James Stockdale or Viktor Frankl. You know, they're all, you know, people who kind of made the best of a very extremely difficult circumstances. But how many people like them could have, you know, put that out? We got any more questions? Leo.
Oh, well, firstly, thank you, Gabriele. That was an excellent presentation, very, very interesting. Yeah, so I think I agreed with sort of Aristotle's point that external goods are an enabler, but I didn't find it to be in conflict with what the Stoics teach. So I think it was Fadi that mentioned it's the use to which you put objects that determines whether it's good or bad, not the objects themselves. And I was thinking of examples. So, you know, with Epictetus, he was born a slave, so
yeah,
he had limited opportunities, but clearly he, within the circle of control that he had, he was able to elevate himself. Whereas with Seneca, for example, I think he was one of the wealthiest people in Rome at one point, right? More than even Nero. Yeah. So I think, you know, it's an enabler. So if you don't have wealth, you might, or goods, external goods, then you may not be able to reach those peaks that you would otherwise if you did have them. But I still think you can do something in the way Epictetus did. So I suppose my question would be, could you elaborate further on the contradiction? Because to me, they're quite consistent, actually. I don't see them as being, you know, in conflict. Thanks.
Thank you, Leo. I mean, that's very, very interesting point. Actually, I think that Aristotle and the Stoics are roughly in agreement about what we should do. Okay, namely, we should use the external goods, okay, in a way that is compatible with our virtue. Okay, for both of them, besides, there is no list of actions that are good or bad. Okay, there is a good character, a bad character, and you know, having a good character, one of the marks of that is to be able to read, okay, the situations and know what to do. So they are in agreement on this, and I think you are right, but they disagree on one point. I think, what happens if there are no advantages to life? Well, the Stoics say it doesn't matter, because the meaning of indifferent is just that. It doesn't matter. Okay. Aristotle would say it does matter, because if there are no advantages to life, there is no comfort, there is no, the conditions which you operate are too difficult, then even to do what we and the Stoics agree that we should do might become difficult, if not impossible. So I would say they agree on what we should do, on the relationship that we should have towards the external goods, but they disagree on whether it matters or doesn't matter if they are not there. Okay, if we have no resources. So Aristotle says in the passage that I read that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be happy without resources. Perhaps this sort of very difficult, if not impossible, means that, well, I mean, there might be people who are strong enough to be good even in difficult circumstances, but normally that's really something hard to do. Okay, I don't know if that helps a little bit or that clarifies things a little bit.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I suppose what I would respond is it depends on the extent to which those resources are within our control. So when we think of the Jim Stockdale or the Viktor Frankl, you know, they didn't have control over their resources, so they did what they could within that framework. But perhaps Seneca, who did have control, was able to use that to benefit himself, and then with that wealth still live a virtuous life. So I still find it consistent, actually. I don't find it inconsistent, but I hear what you're saying. So it sounds like Aristotle thinks, you know, it's a real necessity to sort of step up the levels, whereas the Stoics would say it doesn't matter. Is that kind of what you suggest?
I mean, yes. I mean, the external goods are conditions without which, in some sense, normally, okay, there might be heroes, but you know, normally you can't be happy, okay. But by the way, as I said, some resources, that's crucial, because Aristotle is one of the champions of sustainability in a way. I mean, the idea that you know, the question of how much is enough is central to him. He's not encouraging people at all to make money. He's talking about a certain amount of external goods that might remove obstacles. Okay, so moderation is crucial here. I think the question of being up to us or being outside or inside within our control. I mean, that's an interesting idea. I think from within Stoicism that works. But in my view, it seems to be that it might be an accident of life, that, you know, some things are important, but unfortunately subject to fortune and chance. And there's a much that we can do about it, even though the Stoics would reject that, because they believe that nature is providentially organized. And so nothing that is important is subject to fortune and chance. Actually, is subject to necessity and fate. And so they have the right idea of nature. But Aristotle has a very optimistic idea of nature, namely nature works for the maintenance and, you know, of its own creatures, but not as strongly as the Stoics. Things might go wrong.
Thank you, especially for those of you who have got their camera switched off. If you can raise your digital hand if you want to ask a question. If you got a question, that is. And meanwhile, Gabriele, I was going to ask you possibly a bit off topic, but at one point you linked the know thyself maxim with happiness. And I'm just wondering if you can shed some light on that.
Yes, I mean I think the for the Greeks, this idea of know self. I mean, this was declined in many different ways. I suppose at the beginning, the idea must have been know your own limits, your own boundaries. Okay, for instance, you need to know your nature, and you know, make sure that you don't pass your boundaries, or for instance, by doing things that only the gods do, or something like that. That must have been the original idea. If you do that, if you live with of your own nature, you will be happy. The gods will respect you, and they might even give you something in return. Then obviously with Socrates, this notion of knowing yourself becomes something else, much closer to the Stoic idea. Namely, the idea is to know that the only thing that matters in life is to take care of yourself. And to take care of yourself is to cultivate the virtue. For Socrates, that's like, as for the Stoics, that's equivalent to knowing the virtues. I mean, you need to know what these things are. So for instance,
sorry to butt in. So basically, you could say that you got to know that for yourself that the virtue is important, that virtue is a priority in order to obviously pursue virtue, isn't it? It's a bit about self-awareness, and you've got to know where you're heading, if in order to reach your goals, kind of thing.
I think there are both things. I mean, there is, as you say, you need to know for yourself. That's very Socratic and then Stoic. I mean, no one can do the job for you of knowing yourself. That's one thing. But the other thing is you need to know your own nature. And your own nature is to carry yourself, maybe to go for virtues. And Socrates says in Plato's Apology that money and glory, if I remember, don't produce virtue, but virtue produces money and glory. What he means is not obviously that virtue will give you access to the indifferents, to use Stoic terminology. What he means is that the only way for you, okay, to do the things that normally people do, to live a normal life, to make money, to have political responsibilities, the only way for you to do so well is to be virtuous. Okay. So yes, I think that know that tradition with Socrates and to some extent Plato and Aristotle, but mainly the Stoics, the idea of knowing your own nature, that you're rational, that you need to pursue the virtues. Plus what you were saying, that's something that we have to do for ourselves. I mean, nobody else can do it for us.
Thank you. And just a small footnote. Well, whenever you obviously talking about happiness, you're talking about happiness in the as eudaimonia, as a eudaimonic living. So not the that sentient sort of feeling that we have, temporary feeling of happiness, as we commonly
absolutely.
Yeah,
flourishing, fulfillment. Even though it must be said that for both Aristotle and the Stoics, I think in this they agree. When you are happy in that sense, when you flourish, you also feel very, very good. Okay. For instance, there are all these texts in which the Stoics describe the Stoic sage just out with flair, with style, namely, when an action is good, it's also beautiful to see. I mean, there is something aesthetic in that as well. And Aristotle says that a good action is accompanied by a feeling of satisfaction. Yeah. So I think obviously we do want to say that the ancients don't have this sort of notion of happiness as excitement or momentary satisfaction. That's obviously true, but they don't deny that the good person feels good about it. Okay.
And in fact, that type of feeling, it's a more lasting feeling, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's a feeling of contentment that's got to do with you. Yeah. Terry.
Thanks. A couple of questions, actually. You were saying, looking for other arguments to take the Stoic view rather than the Aristotelian one. And I was thinking that one of those might be not having to draw any lines. So not having to draw any lines to decide whether you have sufficiently few obstacles for this philosophy to be useful for you. So if you were Aristotle, you might say if you're a slave, then philosophy is no use to you because you haven't got sufficient agency. Whereas if you were a Stoic, you would say, it doesn't matter if you're a prisoner or whatever, you still have sufficient agency to use Stoicism. And just along the same lines, actually, when you read Epictetus, he's extremely confrontational sometimes. And for me, I find that tremendously advantageous because you say, to yourself, this is absurd, this can't possibly be right. And that's when there's a learning opportunity. And when you read modern books, sometimes they're softening it too much. So you think, oh yeah, that's right. You tick all the boxes. But because it's not sufficiently aggressive enough, there isn't really much learning going on, or less learning if you were reading Epictetus, himself. But then the other question, while I have you, I find this ancient philosophy is extraordinarily relevant to modern life. At least it is for me. And I guess that makes it a bit of a mystery to me. How is it that this stuff that was written 2000 years ago can now just be rolled out, if you like, in my life and lots of other people's life? And they find that, you know, yes, these intuitions that they had are still spot on now. In fact, I may be even made more concrete, if you like, by evolutionary biology, for instance, which does seem to support the intuitions. So actually, I was reading the other day, someone suggested that sexual selection is the reason for the development of the virtues, in that, you know, good partner and good parent are sexually selected for. And so in that way, evolution produces the same virtues that we, the ancients, you know, were talking about.
I mean, on the second point, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, I haven't thought about it, but certainly it's astonishing how things have become. I wonder if they have become so important to us because of the failure of other strategies that we have used to describe happiness. I mean, modern ideas, even the ones that have passed into, I don't know, the way we treat people, the way we treat medically, I mean, people, or they perhaps are slightly all around protocols and things like that. I mean, they obviously are very helpful, but there is a feeling at times that some sort of more holistic approach in which you might be better. But I don't have obviously an answer to this to the why. I mean, these things are so successful today. I'm just glad that they are, in a way. On your first point, your first point, sorry, the agency. I think one thing I would like to say is that for Aristotle, perhaps the ideal is not so much acting in the world in the way people normally do, you know, like interacting with, I mean, doing politics or changing society. Perhaps for Aristotle, the ideal is science. Okay. The study of nature, study of mathematics, the study of philosophy. So if that's the ideal, then it's understandable in a way that you need certain conditions to operate properly. Okay. If people are too busy, in some sense, with ordinary things, they might not find the time or the focus or whatever to do science properly. I think the Stoics, though obviously they identify virtue with knowledge, when they think about knowledge, they think about something more comprehensive. So it's knowledge also not just of mathematics, physics, and for them, knowledge is knowledge of everything that is relevant to human beings. And in particular, I would say knowledge of, you know, of ethics as well. So they think differently from Aristotle that you know, ethics is an exact science, and so that we can know what to do all the time if we are good people. So I think this difference explains why Aristotle insists so much on the conditions in which you operate, while the Stoics, you know, don't emphasize that aspect particularly. But it's a good point. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Any more questions? Antonio.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Gabriele. I just wanted to ask something that is actually a little bit off topic. It's about what you were saying about the what's in our control and what's not in our control. I just want you to know what you thought about that, because I always have trouble with that list. In that, in my view, the desires and aversions are not in our control, and going back to the Buddhist the Buddhist take on that, in Buddhism, that it would be involuntary. You know, the desires and aversions that come up are involuntary. There is a point that you can choose how you relate to them, so in that sense you have some control, but you can't actually directly control them. So I just want you to know what you think about that.
I think that's very interesting. I mean, the Stoics take it for granted that inclinations and aversions are under our control, at least if they are understood in a very robust sense. Namely, they recognize that we could, on the spur of the moment, somehow be subject to impulses and emotions and stuff. But they think that for us to have a proper inclination or aversion, we need to give our consent or assent to that. So they think that obviously consent being something in our control, these things are in our control. But I think that's, as you say, is a little bit questionable in some sense, because Aristotle, for instance, would say that our inclinations and aversions are the result of a long process in which many things play a role, including the examples that we follow, the thoughts that we had about them, and all these things. And we need to be careful, because if we have the right values, and so we are inclined towards certain things, that's going to stay with us and becomes, as you said, automatic. But if we do the other thing, if we do not make the right choices at the right time, for when we are teenagers, I think we may it may be the case that bad things become automatic. So yes, I think Aristotle would say, in some sense they are, in some sense they are not under our control. It depends a little bit what kind of temporal span you talk about. What do you mean? So in some sense, it would think, obviously, that, I'm not sure, but it would think that Epictetus' idea is slightly simplistic in this particular respect. But it's a very interesting point, because normally we say all these things are under our control, but they may not be. Yeah. Thank you. That's a very interesting point.
Just to come back to that, thank you. I mean, I think, yeah, as you say, a bit simplistic in the sense that, in that sense, I don't find the idea of the dichotomy of control useful, in the sense that, you know, maybe we have some control in some way, but it's not like we either have or we haven't. Anyway, yeah.
Yes, I think, for instance, I think for people like, for instance, Plato and Aristotle, control, self-mastery is important, but it's not the only thing. I mean, in a way, it's not so much about, it's not only about controlling things. It's about, let's say, being in a situation in which you will do the best that you can do automatically, because you have become a good person. But the dichotomy, control, non-control, yes, they would say, is a bit of slightly misleading, though obviously they do insist on control as well. Control, for instance, over passions, emotions, and other things. Yeah.
I find the dichotomy control very useful in certain under certain aspects. For example, if you think about death, you know, you realize that that's something that's not under your control, and it's kind of liberating, because then you're not going to obsess or ruminate about stuff which are otherwise exactly not under your control. So in that respect, I find it quite useful. But that's a very interesting point. I never thought of that. So
but even opinions, I mean, beliefs, in a way, I mean, the Stoics think that at least on a certain understanding of opinion or belief, they are under our control.
Yeah.
But
But
I mean,
truth is,
other traditions would say, in some sense, obviously, I'm always potentially in a position to change my beliefs, but to do so is not as easy as that, namely because my beliefs might be part of a set of beliefs or of a system of beliefs. And in a system, as you know, there are things that are more prominent than others, and then I might be prepared to
and so that's a certain conditioning coming from the society that dictates the way that you think, and yeah,
all these things, and you know, you need to sort of to change your beliefs. You can change them locally, I suppose, or whatever, but you change your fundamental beliefs. There are quite a lot of things that you need to drop, so to speak, and then to say that they are under our control is not entirely wrong, but it's not even entirely right, so to speak. So that's an issue that we I think for
so I was just going to say, maybe Irvine is right when he talks about the trichotomy of control, things that are kind of in the gray area, that partially under and not under our control.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think external circumstances, some are just not out of our control. I would say others we can influence, so they are partly under our control. Similarly for internal states, I mean, yes, they are a bit gray, you know, in that sense, even though it's true that, you know, by training, for instance, I can try to respond in a certain way to things that happen to me, no doubt about it. But what we have in mind when we say so, for instance, are situations in which, I don't know, I lose someone that I care about, and then I learn not to grieve, not to mourn them, or not to feel grief. That's fine, but I think there are reactions that are more rooted in the way we're being trained, educated. You know, it's not so easy. And then sometimes you can lie to yourself as well, namely that you think you have a certain reaction, but then deep inside you're still feeling pain, in a way, to use Epicurean language here. So I think it's a complex issue. I mean, Antonia was right, I mean, to point out that this assumption that they make seems to be straightforward, but it isn't. I mean, entirely straightforward, even though I would say certainly my thoughts are more in my control than, I don't know, what happens now in Carolina, but that's not exactly the point. Okay, the point is whether I can sort of change them in the way the Stoics suggested that we can, and it's so easy to do. Yeah, I think it's very different. I mean, as I see it, it's a complex issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Antonio, for the question. Any more questions, Leo?
Yeah, it's for Gabriele again. I wonder to what extent you think Aristotle's view of the world was coloured by his privilege, and then secondly, if he had swapped places with Epictetus, how do you think he would have fared?
Well, the second one is difficult. I mean, the first one, I think yes, absolutely. I mean, Aristotle is in some sense influenced, I mean, by his particular condition, and even though it must be said, some of his arguments are very general. I mean, if you take them in the abstract, you don't know anything about Aristotle. I mean, they don't seem to be particularly linked to his stance in society or anything. I mean, yes, when it comes to politics, for instance, is preferred society, sort of bears traces of a sort of middle class kind of background with the way he sees the different roles played by different classes. I mean, but when it comes to giving advice on what is ethically relevant and the principles of our life, I mean, his arguments are completely abstract, completely neutral. They don't make reference to any particular, social conditions. For instance, when he defends the idea that virtue, happiness is in some sense the acquisition and exercise of the virtues. Well, he talks about shoemakers and bees and animals, and he says, the function of a bee is to do that. The function of a human being is to be rational. And so if you think about it, virtue, which in Greek is excellence in rationality is virtue. So that's nothing to do. I mean, this is a very abstract argument that could be formulated by anybody. I think. But yes, I think I mean, the swapping question, I don't know, to be honest. Possibly, yes, you wouldn't have had the same ideas, I guess. Even though Epictetus is obviously a former slave, but one that then had the privilege as well, in some sense of an education and the capacity to have readings that helped him to do what he did. So obviously he's talking about his biography in that particular way, but is still someone with a certain level of education and upbringing. Yeah.
Thank you. Terry, okay, should we take just the last one from Terry? I don't want to abuse Gabriele's kindness of that.
Don't worry, I mean, it's fine. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I was thinking about the dichotomy, and I always thought the left-hand side of it was actually aspirational. So, and because it's aspirational, there's a moral responsibility, isn't it? It's a moral responsibility to bring those things, one's beliefs and desires and so on, under one's control. And of course, if that was the case, then there are consequences. So, for example, emotional contagion, which is quite popular just at the moment, will be something that would not be an acceptable for a Stoic, because it.
Can I just stop you there? Can you clarify what emotional contagion is? Because I for one, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, someone gets angry who's your friend, so
right.
You get angry as well. And then before you know it, you've got 100 people who are angry and they're all sending an email or abusing someone on the internet, etc. So what I'm thinking is one can conclude that emotional contagion is an immoral thing to do for a Stoic, because those things are things that should be under your control aspirationally.
I think the aspirationally qualification is interesting. At the same time, one may wonder. It's interesting. I mean, because that would, in some sense, the problem that we're talking about. Let's say, for the Stoic sage, okay, these things would be under control. But obviously, we do admit, as matter of course, that they aren't totally, and so that's why we are on our way to virtue and not virtues yet. But on the other hand, one could say, but the way to become virtues is for the Stoics to make the right decisions and selections. Namely, I need to react to things systematically in a way that expresses my virtues. How can I possibly do that if these internal states are not under my control right from the start? Namely, how can I become virtue if I am so impeded in my full expression of my? Perhaps a compromise would say that you learn how to do it. Okay, and you have an intuition. The Stoics are optimistic about human nature. You have an intuition about certain things that must be avoided, so to speak, or you are told by others, not in the sense of the contagion, but you are told by others and you internalize these ideas. You make these ideas your own, truly, and then you learn how to do these things. And I would say that Aristotle would roughly be in agreement with that. Namely, he would say, yes, we do learn how to react to things, and it's a long way. Okay, so the aspirational thing, I like it. I like it as an interpretation of this sort of Epictetus style approach. Yes, thanks.
I don't think we got any more questions. No, we don't. Well, I just wanted to thank you. Leo, did you have a question? Sorry. Leo, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Absolutely.
No, I was just clapping actually. So just to say.
Okay. I thought it was your digital hand. No, just to say thank you very much for making
Thank
time
you for inviting me.
and,
It's been a very nice discussion
and giving
indeed.
a presentation on this such an interesting topic, and also for the lovely ensuing, very stimulating conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone, for taking part. So we should be back on the 20th with Terry, and it's going to be a presentation on emotions. Thank you all very much for coming, and have a nice, well, whatever's the rest of the day, rest of the Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.